Her grandma kept this secret her whole life, until she finally told the truth about her grandpa. Enjoy the story. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across Eleanor's wrinkled hands. She sat at her usual spot in the Chicago farmers market, arranging her homemade coconut candies and tamarind treats with methodical precision. At 82, her movements had slowed, but her eyes still sparkled with quiet wisdom beneath a crown of silver hair. Children flocked to her stall, drawn by her gentle smile and the sweet confections she'd been selling for decades. To everyone in the neighborhood, she was simply Miss Ellie, the kind old woman who never missed a Sunday market. No one would have guessed that behind those soft brown eyes lay a truth so dark it had shaped her entire existence. Eleanor Matthews had carried this secret for 72 years, a burden heavier than any physical weight she'd ever borne. But today, as she carefully placed the last piece of wax paper under a coconut square, she'd made a decision that sent tremors through her fragile hands. Today she would finally speak. "Miss Ellie," a small girl with pigtails bounced up to her stall. "Do you have the cinnamon ones today?" Eleanor's face brightened. "For you, Lily. Always." She reached beneath the table for a special paper bag she'd prepared earlier. "And here's an extra one for your brother." The child skipped away, clutching her treasures, unaware that she had just witnessed the last normal moment of Eleanor Matthews's public life. Because tomorrow, everyone would know. An old tape recorder sat in Eleanor's apartment, waiting. Her daughter Barbara had helped set it up yesterday. Confusion etched across her face at her mother's sudden insistence on recording her life story. Barbara didn't know that some chapters had been deliberately omitted all these years. No one did. Not her late husband Richard, not her children, not even her closest friend Mabel from church. Eleanor's gnarled fingers trembled as she packed up her unsold candies. The weight of what she planned to do pressed against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. 72 years of silence, 72 years of carrying the burden alone. She wondered, not for the first time, if she was making a mistake. But then she remembered the newspaper article she'd read last month about the little girl from Oak Park, only 9 years old and too afraid to tell anyone what her uncle had done. By the time someone noticed, the damage had been catastrophic. Eleanor had wept for hours after reading that story, recognizing herself in that child's terrified silence. It was for that little girl and countless others that Eleanor would finally tell the truth about what happened in that small blue house in rural Illinois in the summer of 1953, when she was just 10 years old and her name was still Eleanor Jean Wilson. The summer her mother died and her grandfather destroyed her childhood forever. Eleanor had grown up in a humble household on the outskirts of Springfield. Her father worked long hours at the factory while her mother supplemented their income by baking bread for local shops. Their house was small but filled with love, her mother's laughter, her father's gentle hands as he tucked her in at night, the smell of fresh bread that perpetually hung in the air. Then came the morning when her mother couldn't get out of bed, her breathing labored and her skin burning with fever. Eleanor remembered watching from the doorway as her father's face transformed into a mask of panic. He carried her mother to their old pickup truck, his voice breaking as he told Eleanor to be good and care for her younger siblings while he took Mama to the hospital in Chicago. "So your grandfather will be here soon," he'd promised, squeezing her shoulder. "Mind him, Ellie, he'll look after you all until I get back." Eleanor nodded solemnly, fighting back tears as the truck disappeared down the dusty road. At 10 years old, she already understood what it meant to be brave for others. She spent that day caring for 6-year-old Betty and baby Thomas, trying to distract them from their mother's absence with games and stories. When her grandfather arrived that evening, thunder rumbled in the distance. Walter Wilson was a tall man with a stern face permanently etched with disapproval. Eleanor had never felt comfortable around him, though she couldn't have explained why. There was something in his eyes that made her want to hide, something cold and calculating that didn't match his role as her father's father. "Your mama's real sick," he announced without preamble, settling his large frame into her father's chair. "Your pa's staying with her at the hospital tonight. You kids go to bed now. It's late." Eleanor shepherded her siblings to bed, tucking them in as she'd seen her mother do countless times. Only after they had fallen asleep did she allow her own tears to fall, muffling her sobs in her pillow as rain began to lash against the windows. She must have eventually fallen asleep, because she woke suddenly to the creak of her bedroom door. Her grandfather's massive silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by the dim hallway light. The smell of tobacco and whiskey preceded him. "You're the woman of the house now," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent ice through her veins. Time. You learned what that means. What happened next shattered Eleanor's world so completely that for years she would separate herself from the memory, as if it had happened to someone else. Pain, confusion, the terrible weight of him, his hand over her mouth, silencing her screams. The whispered threats about what would happen if she ever told. In the morning, she woke to blood on her sheets and a hollowness that would never fully leave her. She scrubbed the evidence away in cold water, hands raw and trembling, before her siblings could see. When her father called that afternoon with news that her mother had pneumonia and wasn't getting better, Eleanor couldn't even cry. She felt nothing but a terrible numbness. For 3 weeks, while her mother fought for her life in a hospital bed, Eleanor endured nightly visits from her grandfather. She learned to disappear inside herself, to float somewhere near the ceiling while her body endured what her mind could not accept. She became watchful, protective, keeping Betty and Thomas away from him as much as possible. The day her father returned home alone, red-eyed and hollow-cheeked, Eleanor knew before he spoke that her mother was gone. What she didn't know was that her own private nightmare would continue for months afterward. Her father, destroyed by grief, withdrew into himself. He worked longer hours, coming home exhausted and broken. He didn't notice how his eldest daughter flinched at sudden movements, or how she'd grown painfully thin, or how her eyes had taken on a vacant stare. He was too consumed by his own pain to see hers. Walter Wilson became a fixture in their home, ostensibly helping his son by looking after the children. No one questioned his presence. No one saw the bruises on Eleanor's arms where he gripped her too tightly, or noticed how she had stopped singing, stopped laughing, stopped being a child at all. What would happen in that house over the next year would leave scars deeper than any visible wound. Eleanor learned to survive by becoming invisible, by anticipating his moods, by protecting her siblings at all costs. She carried this burden, alone, convinced that no one would believe her if she spoke, or worse, that they would blame her somehow. Would anyone ever see the truth behind the facade of a grieving family being helped by a concerned grandfather? Or would Eleanor's suffering remain hidden forever, a secret buried beneath layers of silence and shame? The old truck in the driveway meant her father had come home early. Eleanor froze, her hand still grasping the flour canister. Her grandfather's fingers dug into her arm, his voice a threatening whisper in her ear. Neither of them had heard the front door open over, the radio playing in the kitchen. Robert Wilson stood in the doorway, still wearing his factory coveralls, his face unreadable as he took in the scene before him. In that frozen moment, as his eyes traveled from his father's grip on his daughter to the terror in Eleanor's eyes, something shifted in the universe. The truth that had been hiding in plain sight suddenly stood exposed in the harsh kitchen light. "Get your hands off my daughter." His voice was quiet, but carried a deadly edge Eleanor had never heard before. What followed happened so quickly that Eleanor would always remember it in fragments. Her grandfather's sneer, her father's lunge forward, the terrible thud as Walter's head struck the corner of the stone hearth, the sudden, absolute stillness, the pool of dark red spreading across the floor. "Ellie," her father said, his voice shaking as he knelt beside the unmoving form of his father. "Take Betty and Thomas outside, now." She did as she was told, gathering her confused siblings onto the porch swing, telling them a story about fairies. To keep them distracted while inside, her father dealt with what had happened. When the sheriff arrived an hour later, Robert Wilson explained that his father had been drinking, had tripped and fallen against the hearth in a tragic accident. No one questioned this account. The whiskey bottle on the table confirmed the story. Case closed. That night, after Betty and Thomas were asleep, her father came to Eleanor's room and sat on the edge of her bed. His hands trembled as he smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "One day," he said softly, You'll tell me everything, but not today. Today we protect the innocent. He looked toward the door, toward the rooms where her siblings slept peacefully. I failed you, Ellie. I should have seen. I should have known. Eleanor reached for his hand. You didn't know, Daddy. I know. Now, he said, his voice breaking, and I swear to you no one will ever hurt you again. They never spoke directly of what had happened, but everything changed after that night. Robert Wilson transformed himself, becoming both mother and father to his children. He learned to braid Betty's hair and sew buttons on shirts. He baked bread using his late wife's recipe and read bedtime stories in different voices that made Thomas giggle. Most importantly, he watched over Eleanor with fierce protectiveness, giving her space to heal while ensuring she knew she was loved. The years passed. Eleanor graduated high school, then college, becoming an elementary school teacher. She met Richard Matthews, a kind-eyed doctor who courted her with patience when she flinched at his touch, who never pushed when she said she wasn't ready, who somehow understood that she carried wounds he couldn't see. On their wedding night, Eleanor finally told him a version of her story, not everything, but enough that he understood why intimacy was difficult for her. Richard held her as she cried, his gentle acceptance a balm to her scarred soul. We'll go as slowly as you need, he promised. We have our whole lives ahead of us. And they did build a life together, a beautiful home in Chicago's suburbs, 2 children who never knew their great-grandfather, years of quiet happiness punctuated by ordinary joys and sorrows. Eleanor became known for her candies, which she began making when Barbara was small, recreating the coconut treats her mother had once made. The Sunday market became her ritual, her connection to a community that knew nothing of her past. Through it all, she kept her secret. Even as the women's movement emerged and others began to speak of experiences similar to hers, Eleanor remained silent. She told herself it was to protect her father's memory or to shield her children from an ugly truth. But deep down, she knew it was fear. Fear that speaking would somehow make it all real again, would transform her from survivor back to victim. Her father died of a heart attack when Eleanor was 48. Richard followed 20 years later, leaving her alone with her memories and her regrets. It was only then, in the quiet of her widowhood, that Eleanor began to consider breaking her silence. Have you ever carried a secret so heavy it shaped your entire life? Do you know someone who has lived behind a facade, protecting others from her painful truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The decision crystallized one Sunday after market, when Eleanor saw a television report about children coming forward decades after suffering abuse. The interviewer asked one woman why she had waited so long to tell her story. Because now, the woman said, her eyes clear and direct, I'm finally stronger than my fear. Those words echoed in Eleanor's mind for days afterward. Was she stronger than her fear? Had 72 years of silence actually protected anyone, or had it simply protected the memory of a monster? The turning point came when Eleanor's granddaughter, Lisa, brought her young daughter to visit. 7-year-old Olivia sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, happily decorating cookies when she looked up with innocent curiosity. Grandma Ellie, why do you make so many sweets? Did your mum teach you? The simple question pierced Eleanor's heart. Here was her mother's great-great-granddaughter, who knew nothing about the woman who had loved to bake, whose life had been cut short by illness, whose absence had set in motion the darkest chapter of Eleanor's life. My mother was a wonderful baker, Eleanor said carefully. She made the best bread in Springfield. What else did she do? Olivia persisted. Eleanor realized then that in protecting her secret, she had also buried the memory of her mother, the good that had existed before the bad. She had allowed her grandfather's crime to eclipse even this, to rob her of her right to share her full history with her family. That night, Eleanor called Barbara and asked for help setting up a recording. It was time to reclaim her story, all of it from beginning to end. The next morning, Eleanor sat before the tape recorder in her living room, hands folded in her lap. Outside, Chicago bustled with life. Cars honking, people hurrying to work, children walking to school. She took a deep breath and pressed record. My name is Eleanor Jean Wilson Matthews, she began. I am 82 years old, and for 72 years I have kept a secret that was never mine to bear. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, telling of the blue house with red geraniums at the window, of her parents' love, of the day her mother fell ill. She spoke of rain against windows and a door opening in the night, of pain and betrayal and a childhood stolen, of blood on sheets and bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. She described the day her father discovered the truth, the accident that ended her torment, and the silent pact they made to protect her younger siblings. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted her father's transformation, his devotion to his children, his quiet strength in the face of grief and guilt. "He carried that secret with me," she said, her voice breaking. "He never spoke of it again. But he changed. He became both mother and father to us. He braided Betty's hair, taught Thomas how to read, and made bread using Mama's old recipe. He even learned how to sew buttons and iron shirts." Eleanor spoke of Richard, of their children, of the life she had built despite what had been done to her. She talked about the market, her candies, the joy she found in simple things, and finally she explained why she was breaking her silence now, after all these years. "No child should carry this burden alone into the grave," she said firmly. "And no man who protects his daughter as mine did should be remembered with shame." When she finished recording, Eleanor sat in silence for a long time, feeling lighter than she had in decades. The secret that had bent her back more than age ever could had finally been set down. Not erased, it would always be part of her story, but no longer hers alone to carry. The following Sunday, Eleanor brought her tape to the market. She placed her candies on display as usual, greeted her regular customers with her familiar smile. But when a local news crew arrived to interview the beloved candy lady of Chicago's oldest farmers market, Eleanor was ready with a different story than the human interest piece they had expected. "I have something important to share," she told the surprised reporter, "something that might help others who are suffering in silence." The segment aired the following week. Eleanor sat in Barbara's living room, surrounded by her family, as her story reached homes across Chicago. The phone began ringing almost immediately. Other survivors, some who had kept their secrets for decades, reaching out to thank her for her courage. Among them was a call from a women's shelter in Oak Park. The director asked if Eleanor would be willing to speak with a young girl who had recently been removed from an abusive home, a child who hadn't spoken a word since arriving at the shelter. "She saw your interview," the director explained. "She's been carrying a newspaper clipping of it ever since. I think she needs to hear from someone who understands." 1 week later, Eleanor sat in a bright room with colorful beanbag chairs, across from a solemn-faced 9-year-old with eyes that looked decades older than her years. The child, Maddie, watched Eleanor warily, clutching the newspaper article in her small hand. "I was 10 when it happened to me," Eleanor said softly, not touching the girl, giving her space. "Just about your age." Maddie's eyes widened slightly. "I didn't tell anyone for 72 years, Eleanor continued. "That was my mistake. Because all that time I thought I was alone, but I wasn't, and neither are you." Maddie's lower lip trembled. Did it ever stop hurting?" she whispered, her first words in weeks. Eleanor considered this carefully. "The sharp pain fades," she said honestly, "but there's a scar that remains. The difference is, scars don't hurt the way wounds do. They're just reminders that you survived something difficult." The girl nodded slightly, understanding in her eyes beyond her years. "Would you like one of my candies?" Eleanor asked, opening her bag. "My mother taught me that sweet things can't fix the bad things, but they remind us that good still exists in the world." As Maddie reached for a coconut square, Eleanor saw a glimpse of the child beneath the trauma, a flash of ordinary girlhood not yet extinguished. It gave her hope. In the months that followed, Eleanor continued making her candies and selling them at the market, but now she also visited shelters and schools, sharing age-appropriate versions of her story, helping children understand they didn't have to keep secrets that hurt them. She established a foundation in her mother's name to support trauma counseling for young abuse survivors. Barbara asked her once if she regretted waiting so long to speak the truth. "Every day I waited was a day someone might have been helped," Eleanor admitted. "But I wasn't ready until I was ready. That's something I want others to understand. Healing has no timeline. On Eleanor's 83rd birthday, her family gathered in her small apartment for a celebration. Lisa brought a special gift, a handmade journal with pressed red geraniums on the cover. "For your memories," she explained, "all of them good and bad, because they all matter." That night, after everyone had gone, Eleanor opened the journal and began to write about her mother, not about how she died, but how she lived. The way she sang while kneading bread dough, how she could name every wildflower in the meadow behind their house, the bedtime stories she told, full of brave girls having adventures. For the first time in over 7 decades, Eleanor found that remembering the good no longer automatically summoned the bad. The shadow of her grandfather had finally begun to recede, no longer powerful enough to eclipse the light of earlier, happier memories. 3 days later, Eleanor returned to her spot at the market. A new banner hung above her stall: Eleanor's Candies, Sweetness and Truth. Beside her, homemade treats, lay pamphlets from the Children's Advocacy Center, information about recognizing signs of abuse, resources for survivors. A woman approached hesitantly. "Are you the Eleanor from the news, the one who—" "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "That's me." "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, voice breaking. "My daughter saw your interview. She's 15. She told me last night about her coach. We wouldn't have known if she hadn't heard your story." Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed the woman's hand. Then my 72 years of silence were worth breaking. As the woman walked away, Eleanor noticed Lily, now a little taller, her pigtails replaced by a single braid, skipping toward her stall with her usual enthusiasm. "Miss Ellie, everyone at school is talking about you being on TV. My teacher says you're a hero." Eleanor smiled, passing the girl her usual cinnamon treat. "Not a hero, Lily. Just someone who finally found her voice." Later, as Eleanor packed up her remaining candies, she gazed around at the bustling market, at children running free and laughing, at families shopping together, at ordinary Sunday, life unfolding in all its imperfect beauty. She had spent a lifetime watching scenes like this from behind a wall of silence, always slightly apart, always carrying her secret like an invisible barrier between herself and the world. Now, at 83, Eleanor Matthews finally felt fully present in her own life, scars, memories, truth, and all. The burden she had carried for so long had been transformed into a bridge, connecting her to others who suffered as she had, offering them a path toward healing that she had taken 72 years to find. As she closed her stall for the day, Eleanor thought of her father, how he had protected her as best he could, how he had rebuilt their family from the ashes of tragedy. She thought of her mother, whose face she could now remember clearly again, freed from the shadows that had obscured it for so long. "I told the truth, Mama," she whispered, "for that little girl in Oak Park, for Maddie, for myself." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the market square as Eleanor made her way slowly home, her basket lighter, her heart full, her story, at long last, her own. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments, so that I know you stayed until the E. And with me, thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.